All right, well, things started today, and again, I just want to thank everyone for attending today's webinar presentation on really having a policy on your policies, which is going to be the first part of our three-part webinar series regarding building towards successful policy management. Now, we're going to cover what the responsibilities of management are during today, what a successful policy process includes, provide some guidance on the creation of policies, and really talk about how you can take this valuable information and get started on revamping and improving your organization's current policy management efforts. But first, I think we'd like to just take a minute or two to introduce ourselves and provide really a little more insight on why you should kind of pay attention, listen to what we have to say over the course of this webinar series, starting with the true subject matter expertise, Shelley Coltnow of IntraVires Health Compliance Consultants. Shelley?
Hi, JP. Hello, everyone. Thanks for giving us this opportunity to share in the webinar. By way of introduction, I'm a compliance professional who's had over 20 years as a chief compliance officer for health systems and other types of healthcare organizations. And I've had, as part of that, the responsibility for leading and developing effective processes for policy and procedure development and management. And I've also had leadership roles in developing and running compliance programs for health systems, physician groups, with cycle companies, ACOs, and other kinds of organizations. I'm happy to be with you today to share in this webinar some links for a solid policy process. And I'd like to introduce my colleague, Dan Fisher. Dan?
Thanks, Shelley. Hi, everyone. My name's Dan Fisher, and I'm a consultant for IntraVires Health Compliance Consultants. For over 4 years, I've been leading and supporting the development and drafting of policy systems, codes of conduct, compliance plans, and other organizational infrastructure systems. I'm a compliance professional with a background in population health and compliance operations.
JP?
So for those of you that don't know me, I'm JP Servo from Etactics, Inc. And while I am certainly not a subject matter expertise in this area like Shelley and Dan are, I do have over 7 years of project management and sales experience within the healthcare space concerning the SaaS-based solutions that Etactics currently provides more than 4,000 healthcare organizations, and have really in the last 18 months or so become heavily involved in the development and marketing of our K2 compliance cloud-based management solution. So it's kind of why I'm here, but more or less to facilitate just this webinar series and kind of host Shelley and Dan as the subject matter expertise. But now, to begin today's presentation, just want to briefly talk about what sound policy management is and how it's achieved through building a structured environment, right? And the best way to really illustrate this concept is taking a page out of the ancient Egyptians book and building a pyramid, or in today's case, a policy pyramid. Now, each part of our webinar series will provide you with the necessary components to really build each section of the policy pyramid that you see here, beginning with its foundation, which is essentially the creation of the policies themselves. Then in our next part of the webinar series, we'll discuss the procedures for implementing and carrying out those established policies. And finally, complete the construction of our policy pyramid by introducing best practices to oversee the entire operational side of the policy management. So in the end, much like the ancient Egyptian pyramids that have been able to really withstand the test of time and its weathering elements over thousands of years, the idea is that all of your hard work that has gone into building this successful management structure results in you being able to leave lasting impression on your organization that will stand up to new regulatory bodies and their laws, changes in leadership, or really simply organizational growth. So to help establish the foundation for your policy pyramid, I'm going to really pass the proverbial torch over to Shelley and Dan, who will kind of go through and explain what exactly we mean by having a policies on your policy.
Thank you, JP. I think we can start on the foundation of that policies and procedures as the infrastructure for an organization. The policies and procedures process and what they do is establish their philosophy, the expectations of the organization's board and leadership, and they help guide employees in the performance of their jobs. So for all the responsibilities of management, we kind of use the word the rules of the road. Because policies are so important, we want to go over management's responsibilities for an effective policy system. First, at the highest level, management should really develop a code of conduct with the mission, values, and support in it that foster ethical business practices. And they should keep that in mind the entire policy process. Secondly, management should know about the company's policy and procedure process. They should set an ethical tone at the top for sound business practices and support and participate in the work of the policy team. The other thing, they should be timely and foster timeliness in the development and management of policies. Management should consider using a policy team or committee to guide and manage the policy process. That helps to add continuity, control the quality of the work, and be sure that timeliness element is met. And finally, they should have a formal compliance program. Policies are really an element of an effective compliance program or approach, and they help employees know what to do and how to recognize misconduct. Just to emphasize the code of conduct a little more, code of conduct is a formal document that the board or senior executives or both approve and sponsor, and it states the expectations for everyone who's associated with the company by applying the mission and values to the company's business practices. The code of conduct states the organization's commitment to be ethical and compliant. It can include quality values, expectations about customer or patient experience, the compliance program, or other practices that govern what the company expects from everyone as far as behavior goes. An example of that might be something as simple as we strive to be respectful of others, or it might be much more in ascribing qualities to what respectful really means to the company.
So one key distinction that we like to make is the difference between procedure. A policy is really a high-level statement of the organization's philosophy, principles, and intent, which is why they reflect the mission, vision, and values. For instance, a policy statement might say, it is the policy of the organization to protect the privacy and confidentiality of protected health information. An associated procedure would determine how the organization implements that policy. Senior leaders are generally the ones to develop the procedures, but they can delegate it to teams who perform the procedures. In this case, the senior leader is a sponsor, and the team's leader would be the author.
An associated procedure presents a stepwise description of the procedure as to how the policy will be implemented by those who are impacted by it. We also wanted to give you a distinctive description of a standard operating procedure. It's not necessarily the procedure that you would include in a policy that would have to be formalized in this policy process we're talking about, but it is related to the policy process. A standard operating procedure, or SOP, might be best described as a step-by-step instruction for operations that are routine and repeat frequently in the organization. For example, office could say we have a standard operating procedure for how we conduct intake of new patients, or a hospital could have a standard operating procedure that applies to claims processing. Standard operating procedures help the organization to be efficient, to put quality output and uniformity of performance, but they reduce miscommunication too, and they help compliance out by reflecting regulations. If you have a Lean or Six Sigma program, a standard operating procedure might be a part of that program. They must be consistent, however, with the policy and procedure that's overarching to every process.
Like Shelley just mentioned, then policies and procedures do promote compliance, but one thing they also do is drive business performance and business excellence. They do this by communicating the company's philosophy, intent, and expectations. They also provide material for training and standardization across the organization. They ensure alignment with the organization's missions. Policies and procedures, they also establish understanding for better compliance with applicable laws, regulations, and standards. And they promote safety, consistency, efficiency, and best practices all around. Not having a well-managed policy and procedure process is unnecessary risk. On the flip side, then strong policies close loopholes and manage that risk. A standard approach reduces variation, it increases compliance, and it may reduce liability. Strong policies also encourage the reporting of perceived misconduct. The policy process helps everyone to know or reference the rules of the road, and therefore it reduces misconduct and improves employee engagement.
Now we'll be talking about risks that are associated with a poor policy process and a policy approach. Without the strong policy process, stakeholders could find that internal controls are weak, and that could result in potential audit risks or audit findings, or even a basis for liability or non-compliance. Inaccurate policies can cause unintentional violations because folks would be following an inaccurate policy or procedure. A lack of clarity in policies causes needless work or rework. Clear policies, on the other hand, foster lean work practices with fewer defects. And if you have a Six Sigma program, that would be very important. And this is particularly the case if the policies are aligned with all of the standard operating procedures for more daily operations. Outdated policies can perpetuate outdated or incorrect procedures, which just emphasizes how important the timeliness factor is, as we discussed earlier. The policy approach carries risks too. The risk that a standard operating procedure may be confused with a policy statement can cause unintentional errors and misalignment. That's because standard operating procedures are very detailed, while policies are very broad and philosophical. An uncoordinated approach can essentially cause errors and defects and can expose you to liability for intentional misconduct. And version policies also improve version control, retention, and retrieval. And without the effective policy process, those could be problematic. In essence, a high reliability organization is based on a well-designed, implemented policy process. So as the policy process improves, the organization's reliability improves and its risk is lowered.
So now that we've talked about the risks of weak policies or a weak policy approach, then let's talk about the first step in making your policy process effective. And that first step is to have the guiding policy. So the guiding policy, or the policies on policies, does a few things. It establishes a framework for development, approval, issuance, amendment, maintenance, and retirement of your policies and procedures. It also describes when's a policy needed and how to add one. It usually it designates a sponsor, which is usually a senior leader in the organization, and their role. It describes an author and explains, usually a team leader. It guides version control, retention, retirement, revisions, and destruction of policies and procedures. And the guiding policy also stepwise procedures and explains the connection to SOPs in the organization.
The key features of a guiding policy are enumerated in this slide, and we'll just walk through them quickly. It definitely needs to link to the code of conduct, mission, and values, as we mentioned above. And if you have an employee handbook and human resources policies, definitely referencing those as well. It will require that every policy, procedure, and standard operating procedure has a clear statement of purpose or rationale. Without that, then the policies can overlap and sometimes even be in conflict. A guiding policy also describes the whole policy process. So we have said it's a stepwise type process, and that's outlined in this major policy. It explains the difference between policies, procedures, and standard operating procedures, as Dan mentioned. It creates evidence of your intent to comply with laws, regulations, and standards. And so it becomes very important in any kind of audit, for example. And then it does mention direct the life cycle of policies and procedures in the organization. Looking at it briefly, just graphically here in the next slide, you can see that with creation of a policy as a statement of general philosophy and rather broad in scope, you will need to think about who's going to approve and review the policy before it becomes mainstream in your organization. And that step is usually followed then by implementation. As the policy remains in place for the period before the next review, you'll want to look at it if there's a change that requires an update, because they should be updated to reflect legal or operational changes whenever they happen. As part of the record management system in the organization, the policies are formal records, and so they are subject to making sure that they're maintained according to the organization's record management requirements. And again, we talked a little bit about retirement. When a policy becomes outdated, so for example, if a policy describes something you're not doing anymore, or when a law changes, or when the policy becomes irrelevant to your current processes, it should be retired and maintained in the repository for reference. And ultimately, at a certain point in time, it becomes old enough to become unnecessary to keep, and you'll want to have a destruction program for those.
So earlier we mentioned a policy author and policy sponsor. The guiding policy sets these different role designations. There is an author and a sponsor. The author is usually the team lead, and sponsor an executive sponsor. You may also consider legal and compliance review as a step in your policy process. Shelley mentioned that there's some sort of record management system, a policy manual or repository, and it can be facilitated by a technology solution if you have one. There's an oversight process, and so the policy process has a committee or team, and that committee or team has an executive sponsor. And then there's also some type of enforcement involved in the role designation that includes accountability for adhering to the policy and following the procedure. And it also includes a fair disciplinary approach for non-compliance with the policy. And that's also an element of a compliance program.
In designing a guiding policy, it's important to establish how the policy templates will look and how the rest of your policy to it. So for that, we have suggested a standard way to present the policy on your policy manual, and your guiding policy will also state those requirements. It will include how you're going to title your policy, how you're going to designate the author, and we recommend by job description rather than by an individual's name, because individuals change and maybe job descriptions don't. Same with the executive sponsor, who will support and oversee the policy and actually hold the accountability for its implementation. And then the assignment of the day that it becomes effective. Is it effective when it's signed by the executive? Is it effective when it's distributed? You can decide that and make it a standard through this guiding policy. The next day you're going to review it. Some organizations like to have intervals of a year or two. Others prefer 3 years, and it depends. If you're a hospital, it can align with your accreditation cycle. And then to have a reliable numbering system for your policies that can be used across the entire manual. And our next slide just shows a policy we've created, a template that ultimately meets those general requirements for the way a policy should present information. The components of a guiding policy should be standard, and here's a slide that pretty much goes through what you should include in this guiding policy. A statement of purpose for the policy and a statement of the policy scope. And the scope generally identifies who's impacted by the policy and makes sure that they're considered by essentially referencing them in the scope. And just as an aside, they should be included in the team that's developing and implementing the procedure for this policy. A guiding policy, and probably every policy, should reference the organization's mission and values, perhaps the code of conduct section that's applicable. And then you should have in this policy a list of definitions and abbreviations, especially since if the policy is being put into place to implement a legal requirement or an accreditation requirement, sometimes those requirements use technical language that should be defined for clarity and application to the process. And then a clear stepwise associated procedure should be developed and reviewed with the team that's going to perform that procedure. All forms that may be associated with performing the procedure should be referenced and attached. And then the references would include cross references to other policies that have relevance, or citations to laws, regulations, or standards that are being incorporated in the policy. And the next slide, just from the same template that we've developed, shows how a procedure might look, or how these elements might look in a policy.
So we've talked about the content that might be in a guiding policy and how the structure of it might look, but it's also important to talk about some style guidelines for writing these policies. One of the recommendations we have is to use the same program to write your policies, procedures, and SOPs. That way, the formatting, the margins, the printability, everything standard across the organization. We recommend using job titles instead of names. We also preferred the use of clear and concise language with present voice. Instead of the boy will kick the ball, then the boy kicks the ball. We avoid passive voice and absolutes like always or never. We avoid ambiguous words like may, could, should, some future terms like will, and all too common some of the commands like shall that pop into policies. We also avoid using information that might become outdated quickly. Policies, they're designed for long-term company philosophies and expectations. So shorter-term processes can be captured in a standard operating procedure or something at the department level. Each policy, definitely when it's styled, should create a summary table at the top. And that summary table, like we showed, would have a blank space for each necessary piece of information, like an author, a sponsor, a numbering system. And then finally, then there should be a system and standards for questions about policies and procedures, a point person or department, or some kind of system for submitting questions and concerns about a policy. And this system for submitting questions and concerns would be standard across the entire policy manual.
When you're developing a policy manual, we thought that the guiding policy ought to have some reference to the parts of the manual that you might put into place. And as part of that, we thought 10 key areas for policy development for any organization would be helpful. The first area that we would recommend including is an organizational structure and leadership authority policy. This is usually one of the more difficult policies to develop, and one way to begin to develop it is to have an up-to-date and detailed organizational chart at hand, so that in writing this policy, it's clearly aligned with how the company actually functions. The second area would be the human resources area. We had mentioned earlier an employee handbook, and sometimes the handbook has a lot of information in it that would equivocate to a standard operating procedure or directions to employees about how to apply for vacation, how to turn in their time, etc. But the human resources policy manual might contain policies about the development and approval of job descriptions, compensation, setting compensation, time and attendance policies, eligibility for FMLA, vacation policies, and important today, especially in today's environment, a policy that applies to anti-harassment and reporting harassment without fear of retaliation. Information technology is a huge area for policy development, and again, it's an area where standard operating procedures can be confused with policy. So it's important to know where the policy and standard operating procedures boundaries are in IT. But information security, especially today when there's so much vulnerability, would be a very important part of the policy manual. Another very important part, no less important, is establishing the controls around financial functions. That would be accounting, investing, credit, and audit standards that the organization will manage through the finance department. Privacy and confidentiality is a critical area for policies, especially for the HIPAA high-tech areas, and also now as we develop more understanding of the GDPR and other standards that might apply to technology for any organization, whether they are directly or indirectly doing business with other jurisdictions. The compliance program is an area of importance for policy development. As we mentioned briefly earlier, There are 7 elements to an effective compliance program. Each element has the potential to support policies in organizational sense. Conflicts of interest are very important to recognize and manage. And so understanding how your organization does that is crucial, and putting it in a policy so everyone understands when to report one, when to manage one is important at the, even to the board level. And then anyone who does business as a healthcare organization and bills Medicaid, especially Medicare and Medicaid, really needs to have a policy about whistleblower protections and non-retaliation. If your organization does over $5 million of Medicaid business a year, that's mandatory. So that's an enormous area of policy importance. And then your operational policies for safety and risk management come into play here. These could be both administrative and operational / clinical policies. And then, as we mentioned before, the retention policies are so important. And actually, for hospitals, is part of their conditions of participation and mandatory to do. So that's just a glimpse at what your policy manual might look like to begin with.
So that was a lot of information, and starting down the road of effective policy management or a policy overhaul is a long-term commitment. But there are some steps that you can take tomorrow in the very near future. So something we recommend doing, in the near future is finding your organization's code of conduct if it has one. And if it doesn't, then if it has a mission statement or a set of core values that it operates on, and really become familiar with those. Those are the commitments and the vision that the organization takes. We also recommend gathering any existing policies, associated procedures, standard operating procedures, tip sheets, protocols, anything that there is in the organization that guides operations. And having those in one place and inventorying those is a fantastic idea that anyone can kick off immediately. There also might be an original template or writing guide for policies and SOPs in the organization, something that people open whenever they draft a new one, a shell, or any kind of style guide, or there might even be a guiding policy already. So we recommend finding that. And then, as Shelley mentioned earlier, having an organizational chart is invaluable. It just shows the department and leadership structure of the organization. And when you go later on to try and assign an author and a sponsor to a policy, then having an organizational chart is a very useful tool. We recommend finding and updating a staff directory along with that org chart. It would have names, titles, and contact information. Again, that way, if you have to ask a question about a policy, voice a concern, or even set up role designations, then having a staff directory and an org chart is a handy thing to do. And then think about your experience with the policy process. This is something that everyone can do. How could you improve it? How do you interact? How might you standardize it? And if you need assistance, then we recommend seeking it, because an effective policy management system is a long-term investment, and starting out on the right foot will be very helpful.
I think to build on what Dan said, just inventorying and auditing your policies or your guiding policy, if you have one, against some of the standards we've presented today will give you an idea of what your gap analysis needs to be. Another thing you might think of, just one more thing, if that's not enough, is to consider having a policy team or committee trying to decide who's going to serve on it. In our next webinar, we'll talk a little bit about the nuts and bolts of how to do that and how to put one of those together and make it run smoothly. Right now, we want to ask JP to talk a little bit about incorporating technology with the policy process and the benefits of having a solution that will help do some of these steps for you.
Great, thank you, Shelley. So to just kind of wrap up today's webinar, obviously we just want to briefly touch base on how incorporating technology into your policy management process is almost a necessity in the world we live in today. Policies through technology can actually now be stored and indexed in a centralized, secure location that's made easily accessible for ongoing employee educations or for managerial reviews, or even accessible or available to third-party assessors that come in and may do some of those gap analysis for you or do some risk assessments. You know, these tools or technologies also provide tracking of the history of each policy, perhaps maybe when it went into effect, what the latest version of the policy is, perhaps what changed from previous versions, or even building in automation to remind the organization when a policy really needs to be reviewed and updated. Those are some specific activities and functions of the technology that's available to organizations today. And in addition to those particular features that I just mentioned, technology can really also be an aid for establishing that standard format that Shelley and Dan had mentioned earlier in the presentation. For instance, there are tools that require users to store and or write policies in a particular standardized format, regardless of the contextual differences between those policies, meaning you may have a policy on security access, and you may have a policy on client or vendor relationships and how to handle those, such as what you're allowed to spend taking a vendor out, or what you're allowed to accept from a vendor in terms of any type of a gift. And then using that tool that requires the policies to be written in format in a specific way, it really normalizes the information for practical and also helps to establish that repeatable and reliable process when you're creating new policies or updating existing ones. Plus, and now we're talking, or everyone is kind of reading and writing in the same language. Everybody's on the same level here. You're not trying to cipher the information because your policies are all in different formats and not easy to really navigate through. And additionally, these technologies also provides a method of documenting the procedural activities that really derive from your established policies. And what do I mean by that? Well, if we take a look at our next part in our webinar series, we've established that foundational level. So you have your policies, right? Or at least you have a blueprint on how to create those policies. At this point, it's time to implement them. Yet another challenging requirement of sound or successment. So an organization may have dozens, hundreds, or even thousands of employees, in addition to the many third-party vendors that they may work with on a daily basis. Well, how do you make sure that your employees and partners know what your rules are or policies, and how do you make sure that they're following those rules or those policies? And that's something we will cover in next month as we continue our webinar series and go over some innovative methods for implementing those policies within your organization. Now, at this time, I'd like to open the floor up for any suggestions or questions, comments regarding today's presentation.
JP, I see one asking if we would upload or email the slides to the participants. I'm assuming that we can do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And Shelley, thanks for asking or talking about that. What everyone was wondering, we've actually recorded today's presentation or webinar, and we'll be sending out a copy of that recording along with the slide share, so you can certainly pass that along throughout the organization and use that as a fundamental resource as you continue to revamp your policy management programs. And we certainly, for everyone that was in attendance today, encourage you all to continue to participate in our webinar series. As I mentioned, this is just the first part. I believe next May 17th, we will be series in part 2. So.
Yeah, and we're looking forward to part 2 because in that webinar, we'll be talking about the nuts and bolts of forming a policy committee and getting the project launched.
Shelley, we had another question that came in just regarding, is there a certificate that our attendees can receive from today? And I know this particular webinar series isn't registered with any of the organizations, but Shelley, I'm sure you can even provide some insight in terms of where our attendees might be able to receive any type of credits or certifications.
You know, some organizations allow individuals who've taken an education program like this to submit the slides or the agenda and obtain individual credit. And I would suggest that folks on this webinar, if they do belong to an organization, credit, it's approach. I know the Healthcare Compliance Association does it. I'm pretty sure MGMA does it and some other ones. So attendees should check with their own organizations, and if they do issue individual credits, please feel free to submit for those.
Another question we received is whether or not we'll be sending out registration for the second series, and we will certainly continue to send that out. You'll receive an invitation, much like you had received the initial one that you were able to sign up for. And you can also look out for those on LinkedIn posts, as well as any other social media that we've been able to kind of promote this series on. So a couple different ways, but you'll certainly receive another email regarding the second part registration.
You know, to build on that too, if you believe there's somebody else in your organization who might find it helpful, they certainly can come to the next one. It isn't a prerequisite to hear this one, to go to the next one. So each one would stand alone, as well as being a continuation of this first one. So please feel free to come to the second and third ones. And if you think the topics for those involve somebody else that might be interested, don't hesitate to ask them to attend.
All right. Well, I think that about wraps things up with all the questions from our audience. Again, on behalf of Etactics and Shelley, I'm sure on your behalf and your organization, we'd like to thank everyone for attending, and we certainly hope to see everyone at our next part. And again, if there are any other questions that you didn't get a chance to ask, by all means, feel free to reach out to any one of us, or have any questions about some of the services that each of our respective organizations provide. We'd be happy to provide additional information on those as well. Sorry, go ahead, Kelly.
I just wanted to mention our website, which is getbettercompliance.com. I don't believe we put that on there, and our contact information is there on the website as well. So I just wanted to let folks know where that is.
Absolutely, and to Shelley's point, we can include that in the follow-up emails that everyone will receive, along with the copy of the recording of the webinar, along with the slide share that accompanied the presentation. So, be plenty of information to access. And again, we thank you all for attending today, and look forward to seeing you next month.
Thanks,
Thanks,
everybody.
JP. Thanks, everyone.